In the quiet of the night when the world is asleep, there are stories that have never been told. They are stories of power that does not need the spotlight of influence, that does not need applause of a force that has quietly shaped human history for nearly 5 centuries. Today, we will embark together on a journey to discover one of the greatest mysteries of the modern world, the story of the Jesuit order and the mysterious Black Pope. When we think of the Vatican, the first image that comes to mind is often the holy white throne, where the Pope blesses millions of believers around the world. But few people know that just a few steps away in a humble building without a crown or white robe, there is a power that many believe far exceeds that of the official throne. It is the residence of the Superior General, the so-called Black Pope. I often wonder why a religious power is called by such a name that is both respectful and terrifying. The answer lies in the very nature of true power. While the light of the white throne shines throughout the world, the darkness of the dark throne penetrates every corner of society, more subtly and persistently. The Jesuit order, or Society of Jesus as it is officially known, was founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish knight who fought in battle until a serious wound left him bedridden. During his long convalescence, Ignatius never abandoned his warrior spirit, simply replacing his sword with the Bible. What is remarkable is that he built a fully military-structured religious order with a system of ranks, orders, and absolute discipline. This is what made me uneasy when I studied the history of the Jesuits, a religious organization designed as a military unit with an oath of absolute obedience not to God, but to a specific person, the Superior General. What did this mean? It meant that thousands of monks around the world were willing to carry out any order from a man sitting in a small room in Rome without question or hesitation. What happened in the 16th and 17th centuries proved that Ignatius's strategy was more than just theory. The Jesuits did something that few religious orders in history had dared to do. They penetrated directly into the secular power centers of Europe. Instead of hiding away in remote monasteries, they boldly entered royal courts, scholarly councils, and the places where the most important decisions were made. What I find most disturbing about this strategy is not their presence, but the way they operate. They do not need thrones because they have mastered the art of influencing those who already occupy them. In France, Jesuits not only taught in the royal schools, but also became spiritual guides to members of the Bourbon family, one of the most powerful dynasties on the continent. I realized that this was a quiet revolution in the understanding of power. Instead of seizing power by force, the Jesuits took a much more subtle path. They shaped the minds of those in power. A prince educated by a Jesuit would take the Jesuit philosophy with him to the throne. A general, shaped by the Jesuit way of thinking, would make military decisions in ways that were in the best interests of the order. This reminds me of a famous saying, "Give me the education of a child for the first 7 years of his life, and I will make the man you will." The Jesuits applied this principle systematically and globally. They educated children not just for 7 years, but throughout the childhood and adolescence of princes, princesses, and noble children all over Europe. The 18th century marked a dramatic turning point in the history of the Jesuit order. What I found most remarkable was not the fact that they were expelled from over 80 countries and territories, but how they responded to this purge. Instead of resisting or rebelling, they simply disappeared. It was as if they had anticipated this and had prepared a response plan. When Pope Clement XIV issued a decree in 1773, officially dissolving the Society of Jesus, had imagined it would be the end of one of the most powerful organizations in history, but the reality was quite different. What happened over the next 40 years proved that the Jesuits were not just a religious order, but a system of thought and network of influence, capable of surviving independently of any official declaration. During the ban, the former Jesuits did not sit idly by. They shifted roles, changed their dress, but continued to teach right and train new generations under various names. There is even evidence that they were protected by some noble families who understood that the Jesuits might be banned, but the ideas they had planted would outlast any royal decree. In 1814, when Pope Pius VII officially restored the Jesuits, I realized that this was not the revival of an old organization, but the emergence of a new force, stronger, more subtle, and more elusive. They had learned the lesson of the purge. Real power lies not in being in the public eye, but in being able to influence from behind the scenes. One of the most intriguing aspects of my study of the Jesuits is their mysterious relationship with the Freemasons. On the surface, the two organizations seem to be diametrically opposed. The Vatican has repeatedly denounced the Freemasons as heretical, atheistic, and dangerous to the faith. In contrast, the Freemasons have often viewed the Catholic Church as an outdated, oppressive, and hostile force to free thought. But as I dug deeper, I discovered uncanny similarities between the two organizations. Both operate in secrecy. Both have strict hierarchical structures. Both have global networks, and both demand absolute loyalty from their members. This made me wonder, are they really enemies, or just two branches of the same power structure? Some historical accounts suggest that during the period of expulsion, many former Jesuits sought refuge in Freemason lodges and continued their activities. They brought with them the extensive knowledge, organizational skills, and most importantly, the network of contacts that Freemasonry needed to expand its influence throughout Europe and the New World. I found that despite their differences in form and creed, both Jesuits and Freemasons share a common goal to control the course of history through influencing the elite. One uses faith, the other reason, but both understand that true power lies in the ability to shape how people think, feel, and act. When it comes to the darkest pages in the history of the Catholic Church, it is impossible not to mention the Inquisition. But what is less known is the silent but decisive role that the Jesuits played in shaping and operating this machine of thought control. I was horrified to learn how the Jesuits operated within this system. They did not need to directly torture or judge anyone. Instead, they acted as the psychological engineers of the Inquisition, writing manuals that defined the boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy, designing thought filters in schools, and most importantly, creating an environment where people automatically censored themselves. The most frightening thing I learned was how effective this approach was. Instead of punishing people for dangerous ideas, the Jesuits created a system where those ideas would disappear before they had a chance to grow. They didn't kill ideas with violence, but with deliberate silence. The Superior General, from his remote office in Rome, could decide the fate of a scholar in Paris or a theologian in Madrid with a short note sent through his network of priests. This was no longer evangelism, but psychological manipulation through the intellect. This was no longer defending the faith, but redefining it through invisible control. Moving into the modern era, I realized that the Jesuits had evolved into what could be called the first soft power superpower in history. The Vatican, with an area of only 44 hectares, smaller than a standard golf course, could influence the policies of countries around the world. And behind this influence, the shadow of the Jesuits was always present. What I find most remarkable is how they have built a global network of influence without armies, independent central banks, or natural resources. Instead, they have something far more valuable, the ability to shape the minds of those who will become world leaders. Today, Jesuits operate in over 110 countries with a network of prestigious universities, research centers, charities, and international advisory boards. They have no need for embassies because each Jesuit church school and university is a cultural outpost where they teach and quietly connect with local power structures. I often wonder if it is a coincidence that so many South American presidents, Asian prime ministers, and political leaders around the world have been educated in the Jesuit system. Whether by design or by accident, they often carry with them the philosophy, discipline, and loyalty to the order that shaped them from childhood. In modern politics, ideological loyalties can be more enduring than military alliances. A policy, a worldview, a quiet belief, if planted in childhood, can outlast any pact. And the Jesuits understood this well. One of the things that impressed me most about the Jesuits was their ability to gather and process information. The Vatican has no satellites, but information flows in constantly. The Jesuits have no public intelligence agency, but in every classroom, every charity, every church, there are people who know when to listen, when to observe, and, most importantly, who to report to. This reminds me of a profound observation. The Vatican is the only state that does not need to declare its power because every other center of power already knows what the Vatican holds. And in that silent machine, the Superior General never needs to step into the light. He just makes sure that every link works, from a schoolboy in Manila to a researcher in Boston to a priest in Buenos Aires. When necessary, he did not issue orders, but simply changed the direction of thinking. In a world where missiles meant less than information, and ideas more than force, the Vatican, with its sophisticated and complex system, built by the Jesuits, became a truly influential superpower. Of all the mysteries surrounding the Vatican, perhaps none is more terrifying than the mysterious death of Pope John Paul I in 1978. After only 33 days in office, this reformist pope passed away under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind questions that to this day have yet to be satisfactorily answered. What I found most disturbing was not his death, but the utter silence that surrounded it. There was no autopsy, no independent investigation, no detailed medical report. Everything was sealed off as God's will. But for those familiar with the inner workings of the Vatican, this silence was louder than any funeral bell. John Paul I was known for his reformist vision, his closeness to the faithful, and especially his intention to cleanse the Vatican's financial system of growing political and financial entanglements. He was said to be preparing a complete restructuring of the Vatican's financial system, with particular focus on the Vatican Bank, which has long been rumored to be involved in money laundering fraud and ties to the Italian mafia. What worries me is that among the figures John Paul I intended to eliminate, many were said to have direct or indirect connections to the Jesuit order. No one directly named the Superior General, but independent investigations by journalists, historians, and even former intelligence agents all pointed in the same direction. There was a hand inside the Vatican, not on camera, but coordinating everything. To understand the true power of the Jesuit order, we cannot ignore the oaths that members take. What I find most terrifying is not the content of the oath, but the way it has been enforced and maintained over the centuries. The principle of perinda ac cadaver, obey like a corpse, is more than just a saying. It represents a philosophy of education and discipline, designed to completely eradicate individual will and replace it with a collective system of thought. The training to become a Jesuit is more than simply studying theology or practicing religious rituals. It is a years-long journey of physical, intellectual, and spiritual tests. But in the end, it all comes down to one thing, the final oath. And in that sacred oath, a Jesuit swears absolute loyalty, not just to the Pope, but especially to the Jesuit Superior General. This is not a symbolic loyalty, but a literal, uncompromising loyalty. I realized that this discipline not only created organizational power, but also an irreversible form of power. Each individual became a loyal broadcaster, serving a global network, serving a single purpose and a single commander. And throughout history, any organization that possessed such loyalty, no matter what its name was, not simply a religion. It was a system, a strategy, a tool in a game much larger than any lecture could describe. As the world entered the post-World War II era, the map of global power was redrawn, not only through diplomatic conferences, but also through intelligence networks in the thick fog of the Cold War. And this is when an unlikely alliance between the CIA, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and the Jesuits emerged. I found that this relationship was not accidental, but a result of a profound strategic awareness. After World War II, when the United States realized that nuclear weapons could never conquer the hearts and minds of people, the CIA began to look for more subtle channels of influence. And in this silent battlefield, the Jesuits, with their hundreds of schools, universities, churches, and charities spread around the world, became the ideal partners. It is particularly noteworthy that many senior CIA officials were educated at Jesuit-run schools, particularly Georgetown University, one of the most influential Jesuit colleges in the United States. Both institutions claim to serve the public, oppose tyranny, and defend freedom. But their understanding of that freedom can be very different and run deep. Strategically, they share a profound goal mind control. One uses espionage technology and data, the other uses preaching education and belief. But the ultimate goal remains the same: to shape the world according to a vision they believe is right. In the modern world, if the CIA is the master of information, the global financial elite is the master of money. And in today's world, there is no more enduring power than the power to control both minds and money. That is why a question that was once considered a conspiracy theory, now it is being looked at more seriously. Are the Jesuits, with their global networks and centuries of influence, linking or even guiding some of the world's richest families and major corporations? I found that the Jesuits had long understood a fundamental truth. A religious order could not survive on faith alone. They had to be financially strong, independent, and resilient. That is why they were among the first religious groups to invest heavily in land education, and especially banking. From mission centers in South America to universities in Europe and North America, the Jesuits had quietly built a vast and complex network of assets. What interests me is that independent research has shown that many of the founders or senior advisors at powerful European banks are either former Jesuits or were trained directly at Jesuit-run schools. Names like Rothschild Morgan, and even some of the more secretive Swiss banking institutions, all have advisors and thinkers with Jesuit-based backgrounds. But the real alliance was not just education, but a shared philosophy. Jesuits didn't simply teach people how to succeed, they taught them to serve a higher purpose. And that value was about order, stability, and moral influence on society. For the global elite, who were constantly looking for a human face to protect their wealth and avoid public backlash, Jesuit thought offered the perfect, quiet partnership. In the contentious modern world, real power needs a place where the world's real decision-makers can gather in silence, away from cameras, free from democratic control, and immune to public pressure. They call these meetings secret conferences. What I find most remarkable is the quiet but steady presence of Jesuits, or those trained in their organizations at Bilderberg meetings, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, or inside Vatican consultative councils. They do not wear robes, they do not claim to represent a religion, but they bring with them a way of thinking, a method of action, and most importantly, an allegiance not to nations or parties, but to a deeper and more ancient order. I often wonder why so many key figures in global strategic councils, from the IMF to NATO, have a Jesuit education. Is it because they are simply brilliant, or because they have been selected? And if so, who is doing the selecting? One of the biggest mysteries surrounds informal meetings between religious leaders and financial power centers. According to some insiders, these gatherings don't discuss theology or faith. They talk about things like how to maintain social order in times of crisis, how to humanely control media narratives, and how to preserve public trust when governments lose credibility. When a story becomes too big, too deep, and too real, the most effective way to make the public stop believing it is to turn it into entertainment. It's a simple but powerful strategy that modern media and the film industry have mastered for decades. And when it comes to secretive power structures like the Jesuits, the Black Popes, or the shadowy networks behind the Vatican Hollywood, and the global mainstream media are never just bystanders. I realized that this technique is called the discrediting effect through fiction, a communication technique widely documented by sociologists and psychologists. When a truth is too disturbing for the public to face, let them laugh at it or enjoy it as entertainment, and soon they will stop looking deeper. It is worth noting that many of the directors, writers, and producers of major Vatican films were educated at or have academic ties to Jesuit universities. Schools like Georgetown Loyola Marymount and Boston College not only teach theology, but also have top-notch film and media programs, and even sponsor religious film projects. And while the public debates whether the Pope is hiding the Holy Grail, or whether Jesus left any lineage, much more real and serious questions are pushed into the mists of the imagination, like the Jesuit power structure, the role of the superior general in global decisions, or the Vatican's financial alliances. South America, a land of indomitable spirit, where the majestic Andes meet the dense Amazon, and where the blood of ancient civilizations still remains at the foot of the statue of Christ the Redeemer. But it is also a continent that throughout the 20th century was constantly shaken by military coups, dictatorships, and ideological conflicts between communism and capitalism. Global observers often blame the CIA, Mossad, or Western economic interests for meddling in the politics of countries like Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Bolivia. But one organization that is rarely named but has its footprint everywhere is the Jesuits. I found that as early as the 17th century, Jesuits had reached the most remote regions of Paraguay, Peru, and Brazil, establishing reductions, isolated religious settlements. These places were not simply missionary outposts, but experimental socio-political models where indigenous people were brought under control in the name of saving their souls. As empires collapsed and South American nations gained independence, the Jesuits did not retreat. They simply changed roles. They became advisors, educators, and sometimes mediators in political crises. But from these positions, they also shaped the minds of those who would one day assume power. It is worth pondering that in the 20th century, as the United States and the Soviet Union turned South America into a Cold War chessboard, many Jesuits openly supported liberation movements, Christian socialism, and the ideals of social equality. They became spiritual allies of resistance groups from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua to the FARC in Colombia. Every dictator has a beginning. Not all are born with a throne at their feet, a gun in their hand, or the presidency waiting for them. Some rise from poverty. Others climb the ranks of elite military schools. But here's the strange thing. Many of them spent their formative years in the homes of Jesuit education. This may seem paradoxical. How could a Catholic order built on service, humility, and education become a breeding ground for authoritarian minds known for oppression and control? The answer lies in the Jesuit educational philosophy discipline, logic, critical thinking, rhetoric, and the art of strategic influence. In Jesuit schools, students are taught more than just theology or classical literature. They are trained to see society as a system that can be understood, shaped, and controlled. I think the most famous example is probably Fidel Castro, the Cuban revolutionary leader who studied at the Colegio de Belén, a prestigious Jesuit school in Havana. There, Castro not only honed his intellect, but also learned the power of tight organization, the use of words as weapons, and the deep pull of idealism. He wasn't just smart, said a priest who taught him. He knew he wanted to change the world. And Castro was not alone. Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, Francois Duvalier of Haiti, all passed through Jesuit-run organizations. Strangely, many of them maintained quiet connections with their spiritual mentors, even after they took power. World War II ended with images of an Allied victory and Nazi Germany reduced to rubble. But anyone who really understands history knows this many notorious war criminals never faced trial. Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, Klaus Barbie. These names did not die in the ruins of Berlin. They disappeared, and their disappearance was not a lucky break, but the result of a sophisticated escape network supported by organizations no one expected. These networks, informally known as rat lines, were clandestine routes that often started in Austria, Italy, or Spain, traveled through religious stops, and headed straight to Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or Syria. The operators did not wear uniforms. They wore monks' robes. In declassified documents, the Vatican, and in particular certain monastic branches in Italy and Austria, were suspected of helping to provide false papers, Red Cross passports, and even theological justifications for mass murderers fleeing Europe. Notably, some members of the Jesuit order were accused of providing safe havens for SS officers, Gestapo agents, and German scientists before they were quietly absorbed into larger networks such as the U.S. Operation Paperclip. I shudder to think about the moral question here: who decides what purpose is noble enough to justify helping serial killers escape justice? Perhaps no one alive can answer that. But one thing is clear: the silence of the Vatican, and especially of powerful religious orders like the Jesuits, is precisely why this network survived and thrived for decades. As the world enters the 21st century, few realize that the Jesuits are still there. No fuss, no flash, but never gone. And at the center of this vast, silent network stands a man who silently oversees nearly 16,000 Jesuits across 112 countries. He doesn't appear on TV, he doesn't post on social media, and outside his inner circle, few really know what he thinks. His name is Arturo Sosa Abascal, a Venezuelan priest born in Caracas in 1948 who holds a doctorate in political science. He has taught at Georgetown University, served as president of a Catholic university, and most notably was elected in 2016 as the 31st Superior General of the Society of Jesus. What makes Arturo Sosa special is not just his academic background, but his subtle, almost elusive political philosophy. While most religious leaders stay away from geopolitics, he speaks openly about capitalism, social injustice, climate change, migration, and the complex relationship between faith and power. I believe he is not only a spiritual leader, but also a behind-the-scenes architect, quietly reshaping the Vatican's role in the emerging global order. A priest well-versed in theology, well-versed in Marxist philosophy, and a former member of international research councils on politics, economics, and sustainable development. As the world entered the 21st century, many believed that the era of political religion was over. The Crusades, the military power of popes, the bloody religious wars, all seemed relics of a distant past. In the modern view, religion was expected to give way to science, democracy, and free markets. But history rarely moves in a straight line, and in the shadow of global crises, climate change, proxy wars, mass migration, poverty, and social injustice, religion is quietly making a comeback not as pure faith, but as a subtle form of political power. The Vatican, with its unbroken vision of 2,000 years, seems to have sensed this return before anyone else. And within the Vatican, the Jesuits, with their talent for strategic discernment and social manipulation, became the operational arm of this return. Not with guns, not with laws, but through ideological influence, through education, through weaving religious philosophy into public policy. This new face of religious power is most evident in South America, where Jesuits are no longer just reciting prayers, but are actively involved in land reform, indigenous rights advocacy, and even dialogue with leftist movements. Religion is no longer on the sidelines of politics. It has returned as an old player with a new face, intellectual, humanitarian, and strategic. We grow up with textbooks, each page a lesson, a timeline, a noble character selected, vetted, and stamped by official approval boards. But for that very reason, what's not in the textbooks is often more important. Because real history, deeper, darker, and sometimes more dangerous, rarely matches what's allowed to be taught. And if there is one name that appears faintly, if at all, in those textbooks, it is this one, Jesuit. Despite playing a central role in education, politics, and religion for nearly 500 years, Jesuitism is rarely explored in a meaningful way in public school curricula. Why? Maybe their influence is too complex, or maybe their quiet power doesn't fit into a 45-minute lesson. But the real reason may be simpler. They don't want students to ask too many questions. No one points out that many of history's most powerful dictators were Jesuit-educated. No textbook explains that global tycoons regularly fund Jesuit organizations. No curriculum reveals that global meetings of finance, technology, and religion are quietly attended by Jesuit observers or advisors. Textbooks fail to mention that during the colonial period, Jesuits acted as bridges between European courts and native civilizations, not just through faith, but through espionage maps and sometimes strategic negotiations. They didn't just preach. They reported, they analyzed, and they memorized. We learn about the world wars in school, but rarely hear about the role of Jesuits in resistance movements, or in post-war reconstruction, or in protecting secret escape networks linked to the Nazis, what people now call Operation Paperclip, or rat lines. From the Middle Ages to the modern era, religion has always had two faces: a sacred face oriented toward God, and a secular face oriented toward power. And when an organization represents both faith and control of information, wealth, people, and strategy, one must ask, where is the line between faith and power, and who guards that line? For the Jesuits, a group that has been expelled from more than 80 countries, but has survived, thrived, and embedded itself more deeply in global power structures, that question becomes even more acute. They preach humility, but operate like a superpower. They pray daily, but oversee dozens of universities, hundreds of research centers, and an informal intelligence network spanning 4 continents. We are taught to think of religion as a refuge for the soul, but when religion controls human data, shapes minds, influences policy, and holds multidisciplinary knowledge, it no longer merely saves, it shapes history. And that is where the lines start to blur. When a superior general can influence universities around the world, from Georgetown in the U.S. to Sofia in Japan to Camillus in Spain, and those institutions produce future presidents, ministers, and CEOs, is that missionary work or strategy? When Jesuits sit on advisory councils at the United Nations on humanitarian issues, climate change, education, and environmental policy, are they serving God, or are they becoming moral directors of the planet? Every empire has its king. Every religion has its grand master. Every system has its architect. But in today's world, where religion, finance, technology, and academia are merging into a new form of power, one final question is more terrifying than ever. Who really holds the power? We see presidents, CEOs, and religious leaders on our screens, but are they really at the heart of power? Or are they just faces, representatives of a much deeper, more ancient, and silent force? Deep in the Vatican, there are doors closed to the public high above the world of academia. There are theories never spoken aloud, and at the heart of the modern age, where data, beliefs, and dreams are manipulated on a daily basis, a silent question continues to resonate. do we really know who calls the shots? In tracing the story of the Jesuits from their harsh vows and hidden influence to exile, rebirth, and vast networks of education and politics, one, truth becomes clear: they never disappeared. They just adapted. They hid in plain sight. And sometimes they stood at the center of it all without ever signing anything. They are called soldiers of God, but perhaps they are the silent architects of a world that no one dares to name. Not by war, not by violence, but by ideas, structures, and power that convince a generation of leaders that they are fighting for justice without ever asking who defines that justice. The Black Pope, an informal title not found in any religious constitution but spoken with quiet reverence. No one elected him in a democratic vote, but his influence far exceeds that of many heads of state. When a man needs no public presence, no campaigning, no social media to shape the course of global education, media ethics, and humanitarian policy, then perhaps he holds real power. You may go through life without ever hearing his name, but if you have attended a Jesuit school, been shaped by Catholic social teachings, or believed in a vision of a just and ideal world, then you have probably heard his whisper. Not a voice that declares, "I am in charge," but a voice that gently asks, "Are you sure you are the one choosing?" In a world awash in data, but hungry for truth, full of faith, but lacking guidance, answers no longer matter. Only the question remains. Silent nagging, never printed in textbooks, who really rules the world we live in? And more frighteningly, when does our faith become their tool? As the night falls and the world sleeps, stories like these remind us that real power rarely appears in the spotlight. It exists in the quiet classrooms, where ideas are cultivated, in the closed-door meetings where decisions are made without the press, and in the silent networks that connect minds around the world. The Jesuit order, in its nearly 500 years of existence, has demonstrated that adaptability is the key to institutional immortality. They have learned to survive revolutions, wars, purges, and major political changes by never fully adhering to any one regime, but always maintaining influence over all. Perhaps the most important lesson we can take from this story is not to fear any particular institution, but to understand that in the modern world, the real power lies with those who can shape how we think about the world. And, to protect ourselves, we need to learn to question not only what we are taught, but who is teaching us, and why. As you sleep peacefully tonight, remember that every idea in our heads has an origin. Every belief we hold was planted by someone. And in a world where information is power, understanding who is providing that information may be the most important thing we can learn. The story of the Black Popes and the Jesuits may end here, but their influence does not. It continues to ripple through every classroom, every book, every policy, and every decision made by those who once sat in their student's chair. And that is perhaps the most enduring power in human history, the power to shape the future by educating the present. As you drift off to sleep, let these thoughts drift gently through your mind. Because in this mysterious world, sometimes understanding the silent forces that shape our lives is the first step to regaining our true autonomy. And perhaps that is the most important lesson this story about dark power wants to convey.